Honor Club, where honor is real.
What's up, wrestling fans? Welcome to episode 3 of Old School in Session. My name is Kevin Eck, and it is my pleasure to introduce the man who makes old school cool. He's the Ring of Honor Director of Operations and has been a promoter and or executive for WCW, the NWA's Georgia Championship Wrestling and Jim Crockett Promotions, and the AWA. He is Gary Juster. Gary, how are you today?
I'm doing well, Kevin. Thank you.
Well, it's great to talk with you again. I mentioned the AWA in the intro there. And last week, we talked about the legendary Bruno Sammartino. This week, we're going to talk about the man who was considered by many to be the AWA's answer to Bruno, in that he was on top as world champion for many years in the 60s, the 70s, and unlike Bruno, even into the 80s. One of his reigns lasted more than 7 years, from 1968 to 1975. Of course, I'm talking about the late Verne Gagne. And we're going to discuss Verne today because he played a major role in you starting your career in the wrestling business. So I know you've told the story before, but for those who may not be familiar, talk a little bit about growing up as a wrestling fan in Minneapolis and being a fan of the AWA, and how you then were able to break into the business.
Growing up in Minneapolis, which was the headquarters, so to speak, of the AWA, it was actually called the Minneapolis Boxing and Wrestling Office. And they produced the local wrestling television show every Saturday night. And then, of course, it would go to other outlets along, around the AWA territory. But I grew up watching Verne. He was a big hero. He was a household name in Minnesota. He was the consummate babyface. He had been a great athlete at the University of Minnesota. He was on a University of Minnesota football team that included such luminaries as Bud Grant, who had been the coach of the Minnesota Vikings forever and is still alive. He's in his 90s. Leo Namalini, who played for the 49ers and later became a wrestler. Butch Levy, who also became a wrestler from Minneapolis. So everybody in Minnesota knew the name Verne Gagne. In the case of Bruno, of course, yes, everybody, it seemed, in the Northeast had heard of Bruno as a professional wrestler. But in Minnesota, people knew Verne from his amateur career as a Minnesota Gopher, both wrestler and football player. As a wrestler, he was an NCAA champion twice. He was an alternate on the Olympic team in 1949. And then he became a trainer of wrestlers. He trained Ric Flair, Larry Hennig, the Iron Sheik, Ricky Steamboat, his son Greg, Jim Brunzell. So Verne had an incredible career. And I first met Verne when I had the idea for the wrestling yearbook and was befriended by Nick Bockwinkel. And Nick, who kayfabed at the time, very diplomatically said, you really need to meet Verne Gagne because he's the world champion and he has a lot of influence in the office. Of course, Verne owned the office with right. Wally Carroll. But Verne took a liking to me. I'm just very, very fortunate. I think I was respectful and ambitious and resourceful. And Verne kind of became a mentor of sorts, but never really smartened me up to the business. I had to get that elsewhere.
And at that stage, you were what, in your early 20s or late teens? How old were you when you had the yearbook idea?
No, I was 15.
Oh, 15. Okay. So yeah, still in high school.
Yeah.
It's amazing that Verne actually, you would think maybe he wouldn't even give a 15-year-old kid the time of day with an idea like that, but he was receptive. Were you surprised that he was receptive?
Yes. Well, yes and no. I had also, I think, as I mentioned to you before, I had promoted a couple of events. I did a promotion when I was a sophomore in high school, and then another one when I was a junior in high school. So they did kind of know me as a hang-around, really. And Verne was sharp, and he had seen that I'd been around, and I'm sure Nick had said something to him. Hey, this is a kid, he's well-spoken. He seems to really love the business. I think he put me over to Verne. So, yeah, I was surprised, but, I was like I say, I was a resourceful kid at the time, and it was just like, yeah, this is great. This is what we'll do. And we did. And I had a partner. His name was Gary Halverson. He took the pictures, and Gary became a big time Hollywood director. He's directed Friends and Everyone Loves Raymond and the Thanksgiving Day Parade on NBC. So he became a big star in his own right.
Wow. So when you go about putting the yearbook together, you said it's just you and another guy, you and your partner. And is he about the same age as you?
Yeah, we were high school. We were friends in high school.
Okay. So
I think we were like juniors in high school by the time this happened. I was probably turning 16. And when I got my driver's license the day I turned 16. So we were on the way to wrestling matches without having to get rides from anybody else. And we would take pictures they gave us full access to take pictures at ringside. And that's kind of, oddly enough, where I started to get smartened up to the business, because Gary would come back after shooting the matches and tell me that the guys were talking to each other in the ring. And that was kind of one of my first clues that about how things were working, so to speak.
Did you have any inkling before that because I'm sure as a fan, I know when I was a kid, I had my parents and basically every adult was telling me, that stuff's not real. And I refused to believe it early on. Did you sort of suspect before, you were totally aware?
I was exactly the same way that you described. I was told by everybody. I didn't believe it. Then later, I didn't want to believe it.
Right.
And then after that, yes, I knew, but I just kayfabed myself. I knew when, they were stomping on the mat, that when you kick somebody in real life, you don't stomp on a mat. And just, and punches that were clearly weazerking punches, because they didn't leave any mark at all on the other one's face. So yeah, it was, I suspended disbelief for my own, to be in my own fantasy world of pro wrestling.
So you mentioned that you had access to the photos and everything, to take photos and things like that. Did you also, were you given access to the wrestlers? Did you interview them for the yearbook? Yeah. Were you able to talk to all of them?
Yes, I talked to all of them. Nick was the first. And then I ended up, if you look at that 72 yearbook, those were all direct interviews, with the exception of a couple guys at the end, one of whom was Dusty Rhodes. Back in 1972, Verne said, there's this kid coming in from Texas, and they sent some pictures. I think Dusty's, as he always called her, the first Mrs. Reynolds, sent in the pictures, Sandy, and they were pictures of Dusty Rhodes from, how old would he have been in 1972? I think early 20s, perhaps.
Sure. Was it intimidating at all, again, as a 16-year-old who loves the business, and all of a sudden here are these larger-than-life stars that you've seen on TV in your living room every Saturday night, and now you're there face-to-face interviewing them and photographing them? Were you intimidated?
Not probably as much as maybe I should have been, because one time I was interviewing Lars Anderson and Larry Hennig, and I really didn't know either one of them. Let's say I was just a kid, and they came in and they mentioned that Larry was the captain of the team. And I said, really? I said, you guys have captains? And they must have taken offense to it. And they said, we consider that an insult. And they got up and they walked out, and they did not come back. I just had to use the material that I had.
Wow.
That was, I think, maybe for the next yearbook. Maybe I was feeling cockier by then.
Okay. So that leads me to my next question. Obviously, the baby faces, I'm sure, I would think they'd be friendly to you, knowing what you were there to do. Were the heels, I guess they were in character, but were they nasty at all to you? Or did they think, well, Verne wants this yearbook and this kid's back here, like, I'm not going to be too much of a heel?
None of the heels were in character to that extent. They might have been heels in terms of what they said, kind of for the tape recorder. because they wanted the answers to be as they stated them. But no, they were actually all very respectful, and I remember just thinking of how nice they were. I mean, Nick Bockwinkel was a heel to begin with, and he was my early mentor. He's the one that opened the door for us. He was a heel, and no, I don't recall any of the heels being in character to the point where they would have been nasty in person.
I love the story about Nick, though, that you started with, that Nick said Verne has a lot of influence. Obviously, Nick and Verne were longtime rivals, and the fact that he put it that way, not giving away that Verne was the owner and the promoter of the company, I thought that was
right.
a clever way for him to do that. Was it just known in Minneapolis? Like you said, everyone knew Verne. Was it kind of known by maybe not, I guess was it known by like adult fans that Verne wasn't just the world champion? Maybe a kid didn't understand it, but did the adults know, hey, he not only is the champion, he owns this thing? Was that public?
There were a lot of newspaper articles back then about Verne just because he was a local celebrity. And just as the articles would often poke some fun at wrestling, they would also mention Verne's business interests in wrestling. But to the average wrestling fan back then, A, they didn't really know about it. They didn't care. And B, it was immaterial to them because they were already either suspending their disbelief or true believers. So it really didn't matter. Verne was, very, very good at kind of kayfabing everybody all the time. He used to, he'd go on TV on these talk shows and they would accuse him, of course, and they'd question whether wrestling was legitimate or not. And Verne would often put the sleeper on somebody and put them out and then wake them up again. And as if that was somehow proof that wrestling was a shoot, the fact that he could actually put people out. But that was what he would do back then. His wife, Mary, used to say, yeah, Verne likes to put the sleeper on people.
That's a great story. I'm so fascinated by the fact that you were able to go backstage in that kayfabe era, because when I was a kid growing up, man, I would have given anything to get a peek behind the curtain. You actually gave me my first chance to go backstage. It was 1985, I believe. Sergeant Slaughter had just left WWF. You brought him in for a show and gave him a shot against Ric Flair for the NWA World's title in the main event. And I was working for the News American at the time, and there was a buddy of mine also worked for the paper. I think we were both like 17 years old and wanted to do a story. And you took us to the back and took us into a little room, and there was Sergeant Slaughter. And of course, we got a little chance to interview him. And of course, Slaughter did not break kayfabe. This is 1985. That wasn't happening. And of course, first question we asked him, why did you leave the WWF? And of course, find out many years later, it was over money. Right? I think it was over merchandising and G.I. Joe, and Vince wouldn't allow him to do that. So he left. And Sarge at the time said, well, I beat Roddy Piper, and I beat the Iron Sheik, and I beat Nikolai Volkov, and they wouldn't give me a shot at Hulk Hogan. They wouldn't give me a shot at the world's title. And here in Baltimore tonight, I get to go for the greatest world title, the NWA World's title. And Gary Juster gave me that opportunity. So yeah, no one was breaking kayfabe at that point. But back in the 70s, when you're back there, nowadays, and we're backstage in Ring of Honor, we see this all the time, and I don't think I'm giving away anything because I think people are smartened up. You will see baby faces and heels walking down the hall, passing each other in the same locker room, going over their matches. You weren't smartened up. So in the 70s, were there two separate dressing rooms like you hear about, like faces on one side and one locker room, heels on the other? Did you ever see them fraternizing?
I did not. In Minneapolis, at the Minneapolis Auditorium, they had separate dressing rooms, but I later found out they had a connection between them. There was a connector door, which was interesting. And I did spot shows, like I say, when I was in high school. and they were all in one locker room, and they just kayfabed. The heels would go to one area, the baby faces would go to the other. I think I might have mentioned to you, the first spot show I ever did, the agent for the office was Bill Watts. So Bill Watts was as kayfabe as they got back then.
Wow.
Maybe still is, for all I know. I don't know. Bill was always very old school. And they just, they considered themselves, quote, professionals. And they stayed in character, and they did not fraternize in front of me or go over anything as far as matches. But as you know, Kevin, when back in those days, they didn't go over matches to the extent they do now. The heel would call the match in the ring for the most part. And if they'd worked together before, and in many cases, if they were working a program, they were working together virtually every night, then, they came to have their matches worked out pretty well.
Yeah, going over the matches in those days was basically the booker going to them and saying, here's the finish. And that was pretty much it, I think, for the most part. And and
the time, right. and also back in those days, the spots, the high spots, were really supposed to be reserved for the main events.
That's right.
And you didn't use other people's finishing holds. You didn't use their moves to a great extent, depending on who they were. So stuff was saved for the main events.
Absolutely. And what you would have sometimes is, I know in the WWF, you would have these preliminary matches. I'm talking about in the 70s now, not later, when every match sort of had a star in it. And a lot of times you'd get the boring chant from the crowd for those early matches. And right. It would be one preliminary guy against another preliminary guy. And you're right, everything was building up the card to the semi-main and obviously the main, where they could do the things that you didn't see in the other matches.
So, now one thing about Verne, who was always main event from the time I knew him until the time that he retired, I don't recall him ever getting juice. Maybe you do, or maybe in the annals somewhere, but I don't recall him ever doing it, which is, kind of remarkable for at least the later part of his career and in that era.
Yeah, now that you mention it, I can't think of, I used to read the After mags religiously, and they would have the bloody photos a lot of times. And it was always the same guys that, they were bleeders, Superstar Billy Graham and Dusty Rhodes and Ric Flair, and obviously the Sheik.
Well, and in the AWA, Baron von Raschke,
yep.
The Crusher, some of the other heels.
Right, but you now that you bring it up, I don't ever recall seeing a photo of Verne Gagne with blood on his face. That's interesting. So talk to me about your relationship with Verne after you do the yearbooks. Do you maintain a relationship with him as you get older, or did you not cross paths again until you were actually promoting in Baltimore?
No, I definitely stayed in touch with Verne, and I was going to school in DC, and I would see Verne whenever I went back to visit Minneapolis. I would try to get to see him. And he put in a good word. My friend Gary Halverson, who I mentioned earlier, had left Minneapolis and come out to Washington, D.C., where I was living, to escape kind of his hometown and come out to the East Coast and pursue what was then a music career. But we were, again, this kind of team of kids who had done the yearbooks in the AWA, and Verne put in a good word for us with Vince, Vince's dad, Vincent J. McMahon. So we did a yearbook in '76, I believe it was, for Vincent J. McMahon, and we used to drive from DC up to Philadelphia and back the same day. We'd drive to the Garden and then drive back the same day. And the first time we were at the Garden, it's one of those kind of seminal moments that I'll never forget, where Vince introduced us to the security people and said, "Give these kids the run of the place." And I thought, wow, I'm at Madison Square Garden and Vince McMahon just said to give us the run of the place. That was pretty cool to me as a college kid at that time.
Yeah, I would think so. I would think so. You hear a lot of the old timers who worked for Verne. I guess he had a reputation among some for maybe being cheap on his payoffs. I'm just curious, when you did these yearbooks for him, did you get compensated for that? Or was it, hey kid, I'll give you a break into the business if you do these yearbooks for free?
We worked out a business arrangement where we took the printing costs off the top and then other costs and had a split. I don't think we really made any money, maybe a little bit. We'd have different wrestlers and ring people taking the books to the different towns, and they wouldn't always reconcile out properly. And we had to kind of trust the office. And so yeah, I think we made a few bucks, but nothing significantly. It was the experience of it that was really what was, even at the time, kind of making it worthwhile. The fact that we were able to do it, but no, it was never seriously lucrative for us.
Yeah, I was going to say, if I was in your position, I probably would have done it for free if I had the opportunity. I want to sneak in a question here. This comes from, it's about Verne. And it comes from someone on Twitter who goes by the handle Pesic or Bust. And he asks, what were the strengths and weaknesses of Verne Gagne's booking, in your opinion?
The strengths of his booking were that he was very good at using characters. The Crusher, Mad Dog Vachon, Big Bill Miller, who was then under the mask of Mr. M. And they had some of those guys, like the Crusher, late in his career, didn't do much in the ring, but he always had guys who were good athletes in the ring. Red Bastien, Nick Bockwinkel, his son Greg, and Verne himself. Verne was, a great performer in the ring. So a combination of characters and a good in-ring product. They were the only wrestling game in town. So the promoters back then had a definite advantage in that they really didn't have any competition to speak of. But notwithstanding that, their TV show was very traditional. They would have a job match with a guy named Kenny J, who's still alive, and a series of other job guys, enhancement talent, as we now kind of call it as a euphemism. And they would get the characters over, and they would have matches on TV that were designed to put people in the seats in the arenas. And sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. It went through cycles. Sometimes it was hot, sometimes it was cold. He was also good at bringing in talent, and he was very good at training talent. But most of the top talent in the country at one time worked Minneapolis.
Absolutely.
Or AWA.
Yeah, and we talked about guys that he trained. A guy that I mentioned in my earlier story, Sergeant Slaughter, also was trained by Verne.
Yeah, the negatives. Some of them are kind of just the corollary of the positives. I mean, the fact that he didn't have competition. They sometimes didn't rise to the top level when it came to maybe the programs that they might work. With someone. Sometimes they would get stale. Sometimes you'd see the same match over and over again, which would happen during their down periods. And of course, the worst thing that happened with Verne was when he could not really see what was happening to what was happening in wrestling nationally with Vince. Verne just kind of stuck to his guns and wanted to do things the old way. Did not take advantage of new opportunities, didn't see those opportunities, and ended up really just losing the promotion. Vince and K. McMahon ended up basically taking all his top talent, including his production people.
Yeah, he took everyone, including, like you said, the production people, including Mean Gene Okerlund. There really was an all-out raid.
His promoters, Dennis Hilgart was Verne's primary partner promoter out of Milwaukee. Really good guy, really good promoter. In fact, when I was young, when I was in college and I wanted to be a promoter, Verne actually sent me down to Milwaukee for a weekend to shadow Dennis Hilgart to learn about how he promoted Milwaukee.
Wow.
Which I did, and that was quite an educational experience for me.
Do you think another one of the weaknesses, I guess, of Verne's booking was that he kept, we mentioned at the top of the show how long he was the world champion, the 60s all the way into the 80s. He held it, I think, like 11 times. So he would lose it, get it back over and over. And I guess the one difference between him and Bruno is that Bruno didn't want the title. I don't think he even wanted it the second time when he won it in 73. He had already held it for almost 8 years. He kind of had to be talked into it by Vincent J. McMahon and was told he would only defend the title at the biggest arenas in the Northeast, not do the smaller shows so he could have more time at home. Whereas with Verne, I guess it was a little bit different. Verne's the owner of the company, so he could put himself on top for all those years. Do you think it lasted too long, in your opinion? And for someone who was following the AWA, obviously I've followed it from magazines and afar. Was Verne, did he still have the drawing power during that last reign when he was, I don't know how old he was at that time. He had to be into his 50s the last time he held the title.
Well, there's a real difference between Verne and Bruno in their circumstances. Bruno worked for Vincent J. McMahon and worked virtually every night of the week, or if not every night, 4 nights a week, all the time. I mean, he was their bread and butter. Whereas Verne was the owner of the company and the owner of the territory, and he got to the point where he would work maybe once or twice a month, if that. So the fact, from a booking standpoint, to me, it almost made it seem as if the title was more prestigious. It was more like boxing, where it wasn't defended all the time. It was special. He'd have to prepare for the title defense. And so I think that was actually probably one of the better parts of his booking. And to people who followed Verne throughout his career, he was so believable, even as he got older, that I don't think it really detracted from him, except maybe, at the end, at the very end, when it was just, too much. And that was common for Booker owners. Fritz von Erich did it. I can probably think of others. I don't know if Eddie Graham did, but, Bookers were, kind of notorious for working on top of the cards, in the main events. And Verne, of course, was no exception. But Verne was a very believable performer until probably the last 4 or 5 years of his career, and then he'd usually just work in tag matches. Right.
I think he and longtime rival Mad Dog Vachon ended up becoming tag team champions in the AWA. And I think towards the end, after he gave up the title for the last time, he actually retired the title, which is, again, something you don't see very often. And it's helpful to be the owner of the company, so that he did not even lose the title the final time. He retired it, and then it was won by Nick Bockwinkel, I believe. Or I think there was a
controversial decision. They gave it to Nick as the number one contender. Verne took a lot of heat because by that time, I think it was to the point where the business was acknowledged as a work. And I apologize for my dog growling. He probably didn't like either the fact that Verne would not put Nick over in that last match, even though he was 55 or whatever. He had to go out in this retirement match with his hand raised. But that was Verne. He had a very large ego, which he was also kind of infamous for. And you might have heard stories over the years about that.
I have. I've heard stories. I never had the pleasure of meeting Verne Gagne, but I've heard the stories in various interviews from guys.
In 1985, I believe, we did our first show at the Meadowlands with Verne and Eddie Einhorn, and Bob Costas was there recording interviews for a show they had on Sunday afternoons back then called NBC Sports World. And, I was this young law school grad / promoter and dressed in a coat and tie, and Bob Costas interviewed me and put me over, told me I did a good job of being interviewed and blah, blah, blah. And then it aired on Sports World. And the next day, I got a call from Verne, and he was just screaming at me that who did I think I was to be interviewed, that if anyone should be interviewed, it should be him, that he was the promoter. And so I kind of sat there and listened to it, and I don't know, I probably apologized to him or something. And then Ken Resnick called me an hour later, and Ken was an announcer, and he worked for Verne in the office, and Jack Lanza was retired, and he worked for Verne in the office, and I knew both of them well. And Ken said Verne came storming in the office that morning and told his assistant Mary Ellen, get Gary Juster on the phone immediately. And Ken said he and Jack looked at each other and rubbed their hands together and said, let's go get popcorn. And sat back and just laughed as Verne had lashed out at me for agreeing to be interviewed and not deferring to him.
Another great story. The best part of that story is definitely Lanza and Resnick with the pop. That's good stuff.
Yeah.
That's good stuff. So you're promoting in Baltimore, and it was initially, as we talked about, Georgia Championship Wrestling. Then it kind of morphs, and you're bringing in, as you talked about before, it was basically 3 Jim Crockett Promotions matches, right? And then 3 matches from the AWA. Yeah. I know at one point you had to make a decision, right? Where you had to go one way or the other.
Yes.
And tell me, why did you have to only go one way? And obviously you went with Jim Crockett Promotions, I think, because they were the bigger draw. Why could you not keep promoting those joint shows?
Verne and Jim Crockett did not get along, and they didn't speak. So I had to be the go-between. And after a few shows, Jim Crockett just called up one day and said, he goes, I'm not going to do this deal with Verne anymore. He said, it's your town. He said, you do what you want. You make a choice. Either you use Verne's talent or use my talent and with the TV show to go with it. And I said, well, Jimmy, I said, there's not really much of a choice. I said, you guys are, your talent is really what's drawing the houses. It was Flair and Dusty and, just down the line. It was just, and by that time, Verne's promotion was waning. So I wrote Verne a letter and I Federal Expressed it to him. And then he was livid again. He called me a traitor, and how could I do that to him? And he broke me in, and I'd never really made any money working with Verne, but I didn't say that to him. And anyway, it was rather acrimonious for a while. We later made up and were friends, and I spoke with him. Last time I spoke with Verne, it was when his wife died, and Verne was already starting to experience Alzheimer's symptoms. So it was kind of a painful call, but anyway, we later, we ended as friends.
Well, that's good. Yeah, I mean, it had to be such a tough decision for you. I mean, from a business standpoint, it was an easy call to make, as you said. I mean, Jim Crockett Promotions was the hotter promotion. They were drawing, and the AWA certainly was on the downside, not the upside. But just, I guess, from a personal standpoint, it had to be difficult because, as you said, he did break you in.
It was difficult, and I did feel badly for it. And I'm glad we were able to patch things up and become friends again, and speak now and then and such. But yeah, it was painful. It was just something that that I had to do, and as I say, by that time, his promotion was really toward the end, and he wasn't drawing in his towns either. And that's one of the reasons why, it was even more painful for him.
Right. I'm wondering, on those cards, as you said, it was like 3 AWA matches, 3 NWA matches, and they were, there wasn't a lot of crossover. I guess now it makes more sense that it was a political landmine with the 2 promoters not liking each other. But did you ever try to do some inter-promotional, for example, Ric Flair was coming to town defending the NWA title. Rick Martel was also on the same card at certain times defending the AWA title. Was there ever a pitch from you to Verne and or Jim Crockett to do a Flair versus Martel match in Baltimore?
No, I think by that time I was smart enough, so to speak, to not try to interfere with the booking.
Okay. I wanted to ask you about the movie The Wrestler. And I'm not talking about the Mickey Rourke movie. I'm sure you know which one I'm talking about. The one with Verne. Did you see that movie when you were a young man and at that time when you were a fan? And if so, what was your first impression of it?
I did see the movie. I had really looked forward to the movie because it had all these wrestlers in it that I had watched as a kid and even now got to work with and such. The movie was bad. It just was not a well done movie. It did have Ed Asner in it, pretty big star, but it wasn't a very good movie. And I was a college student in DC at the time, and I took a bunch of friends to see it at a movie theater in Alexandria, Virginia, in the suburbs, an old theater, and the film broke in the middle, and there was like a 10-minute delay, and I had to urge them to stay for the rest of the film. It just made watching a bad film even worse. It was all kind of a disaster, but yeah, it wasn't really a very good movie, but it did try to tell the story of this, aging wrestler, namely Verne, who was worried about, losing his title, and Billy Robinson was the prime challenger, and then there was some story with it, but it was fun to see the guys up on the screen.
Yeah, I was wondering if maybe you had a different opinion of it when you were young and wide-eyed and maybe thought, wow, this is really cool. And then later saw it as an adult and realized how bad it was. But you realized how bad it was at the time. It was really one of those movies, though, that was so bad it was good. Like, I just watched it a few months ago. And
Really?
yeah, I saw it when I was younger, but I watched it a few months ago. And it really is just such a strange it's a strange movie. Like you said, Ed Asner's in it, who was, he was on Mary Tyler Moore at that time.
Yeah.
As Lou Grant, and he plays this promoter, and there's a great scene in there where I think someone died in the ring. One of the wrestlers died.
Yeah.
And then I think Ray Stevens came off the top with the cannonball. Ed Asner is talking to these newspaper reporters, and they're not believing that the guy just died. And Ed Asner's character is just perplexed and can't believe that they don't understand this is real. And why don't you guys cover this in the sports section? And the one guy says, it should be in the entertainment section. And this is, 72?
74, I believe.
74. Yeah. So what a moment in time. And then there's all these scenes that are just disjointed with various wrestlers and don't seem to have any bearing on the rest of the story. Like Dusty Rhodes and Dick Murdoch beating up guys in a bar. And I think one of the guys they beat up, if I remember correctly, was Professor Tanaka, I believe, wasn't it? If you recall, I think it was.
I don't recall it. It's possible, but I don't recall.
But yeah, strange stuff.
One of the best part of it for me really was that about a year or so after that, I was out in San Francisco just on vacation and went to the matches there that Verne was having. And a bunch of us went out afterwards, which included Ed Asner. He came and joined us. Hulk Hogan was there with us that night. And I think Pat Patterson and Verne and Greg, and a bunch of us went out and ate and drank. It was a lot of fun.
Man, the stories that you have, Gary. I mean, that's why we have Old School in session. The people that you've rubbed elbows with is fascinating. Even Ed Asner.
Very brief rub in that case.
Did you ask him about Mary Tyler Moore? What she's
No. I did not.
Okay. Last thing about Verne is, we're doing the ROH Pure tournament right now, and obviously people are loving it. This seems like, as far as modern wrestling goes, I have a feeling Verne would not like a lot of it, but I think he would like this Pure tournament. Do you agree?
He would love the Pure tournament. Verne was all about the purity of wrestling. Verne used to come on his TV show and promote amateur wrestling, the Minnesota State high school tournament, the AAU tournaments. He would go to he would actually go to these tournaments and help these kids. I mean, he loved amateur wrestling. And he was Mr. Kayfabe. So to him, pro wrestling was merely the next step up, just like any other sport. You go from amateur to professional if you're good enough. That was how Verne saw the business. At least that's how he presented it. His crazy characters, like the Crusher notwithstanding, Verne just loved the purity of wrestling, and would often have babyface matches. I saw Verne work with Billy Robinson, with Ed Carpentier, with Red Bastien, with Bill Watts. They were babyface matches, which were in a way similar to what we see now in the pure tournament.
Yeah, and it's funny, going back to the wrestler, the main storyline in that movie was Verne's setting up this big title match showdown with his longtime in-ring rival, Billy Robinson. So
Right.
and now that you mentioned too about the amateur wrestling, there was also a scene in the movie where Verne goes and talks to a bunch of upcoming wrestlers. I think they were all training to be pros, and he's showing them like a bunch of amateur moves. I think he brought in an amateur wrestler to show all these different holds that they would have to learn and how they could apply it once they get into the AWA, I guess.
Yeah, and in that era, in Verne's era, there were a lot of collegiate wrestlers, amateur wrestlers that became pros.
Yeah. I mean, Chris Taylor, I think, was one of the early ones.
Well, Bob Geigel wrestled, for Iowa. Joe Scarpello was an amateur wrestler. Maurice Vachon from Montreal, not Algeria, was an amateur wrestler, and I believe also possibly an Olympic or Olympic alternate. Khosrow Vaziri, the Iron Sheik, was a coach for the U.S. Olympic team.
Yeah,
I believe in '72. So a lot of them.
Yeah, I think just specific to the AWA, I think again Chris Taylor, I know, was one.
Yeah.
Not that he had a great career in
No, he was not. He was not a successful pro wrestler.
Brad Rheingans, though, was another one, I guess, that started.
Brad was great, and became one of the best trainers in the game as well.
Any other final memories or stories about Verne before we wrap up today?
No, I don't. I think we've touched on them. He had a very sad ending, a real kind of tragic ending. He was in a nursing home for Alzheimer's patients, and he got into a fight with an old guy and shoved him, and the guy later died, and no charges were filed. They said that neither man really was in his kind of right mind, so to speak. They really didn't know what was going on. So no charges were filed. Verne then went to live with one of his daughters, and like I say, just had severe dementia, and died at age 89. And he'd gone through a bankruptcy, and he just his business fell apart, and his wife died. He got Alzheimer's, so he had a rough ending. But early in his life, he was a great amateur, a great professional, ran a very lucrative and successful promotion for many years, was a big local star, and probably would not have had it any other way.
Absolutely, one of the greats for sure. What an interesting career that he had. A long
he did.
And certainly Verne's influence, as you mentioned, all the guys that trained with him and went on to become stars themselves. So Verne's legacy certainly lived on after his career was over. Well, Gary, that is all the time we have for today. I really enjoyed this conversation, as I always do. And I want to thank everybody out there for listening to episode 3 of Old School in Session. As a reminder, we will have a new episode every Wednesday here on ROH's YouTube channel. To submit a question for Gary or a topic you'd like him to discuss, you can do so on Twitter using the hashtag AskGary. For Gary Juster, this is Kevin Eck, and Old School is out. Until next week.